I've always had a bit of an obsession with antiques. There's just something about the stories they carry, the history embedded in every scratch and worn edge. My name's Daniel Harris, and I've been collecting for over a decade now. Ravenswood, my hometown, might be small and quiet, but it's got its fair share of hidden treasures if you know where to look. And believe me, I know where to look. I often find myself driving out to nearby towns, scouring auctions for that next unique piece that'll add character to my collection. Little did I know, my latest find would add something far more sinister. Willow Creek was the kind of town that looked like it had been frozen in time-old brick buildings, faded signs, and an auction house that hadn't seen much action in years. I'd never been there before, but the minute I walked through the door, I felt a strange pull, like I was meant to be there that day. Among the dusty furniture and forgotten trinkets, one piece stood out, an intricately carved rocking chair, sitting alone in a corner, almost like it was waiting for someone. There was something about it that drew me in, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The chair was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Dark wood, with carvings so detailed they seemed almost alive. The craftsmanship was impeccable, and the aura around it, well, let's just say it felt different. I'd heard stories about items carrying the energy of their previous owners, but I'd never given it much thought until that moment. Something about this chair made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off. I was more intrigued than scared. After all, I'd been around antiques long enough to know that every piece has its quirks. I couldn't help but bid on it. The price was a steal, really, considering its condition and the obvious age of the chair. As the auctioneer's gavel came down, signaling my win, I felt a mix of excitement and something else, a feeling I couldn't quite name at the time. Maybe it was the odd look the auctioneer gave me when I went to pay. Or perhaps it was the way the other bidders seemed to avoid looking directly at the chair. Either way, it was mine now, and I was eager to add it to my study back in Ravenswood. Loading the chair into my truck, I noticed how heavy it was, far more than it looked. It took a bit of effort, but I managed. The whole drive back, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that the chair was watching me, if that makes any sense. I know, it sounds crazy, but there was this unsettling awareness about it. I chalked it up to my imagination, probably fueled by too many late nights reading ghost stories. Still, the closer I got to home, the more that feeling grew. When I finally arrived, I carried the chair into my study, where it seemed to fit perfectly among my other antiques. For a moment, I just stood there, admiring it, running my fingers over the smooth wood and the intricate carvings. But then, something strange happened. As I turned to leave the room, I thought I saw the chair rock ever so slightly, just out of the corner of my eye. I paused, staring at it, waiting for it to move again, but it remained still. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. After all, it had been a long day. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the chair. The way it seemed to call out to me at the auction, the weight of it, the way it almost felt alive under my touch. I tried to push those thoughts aside, but they lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to that chair than I'd first thought. But I wouldn't have to wonder for long, because soon enough, I'd find out. The chair looked right at home in my study. Surrounded by other relics of the past, It seemed to blend in perfectly, almost like it had always been there. I remember thinking how it completed the room, giving it that final touch of authenticity I'd been striving for. But from the moment I set it down, things started to feel off. It began with little things you wouldn't really notice unless you were paying close attention. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker somehow, like it was charged with something I couldn't quite explain. At first, it was just a slight creak here and there, the kind of sound you'd expect from old wood settling in, right? But then, it started happening when I wasn't even in the room. I'd be in the kitchen making coffee, and I'd hear it, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like the chair was rocking itself. I'd tell myself it was just the house settling or maybe a draft, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was no draft in my study, and the house had never made sounds like that before. One night, I decided to stay up late in the study, working on some paperwork. The chair was behind me, facing the window. As I worked, I kept hearing that faint creak, almost like a whisper. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand, but it was impossible. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the chair was still. But the moment I turned away, there it was again, that gentle rocking. It was unnerving, to say the least. I wasn't one to get spooked easily, but this was different. This was real. Things escalated quickly after that. I'd leave the room, and when I returned, the chair would be in a different position. Just slightly, but enough that I noticed. Once, I found it turned completely towards the door, as if it had been watching me leave. That was the first time I felt a genuine chill run down my spine. I even started questioning myself, had I moved it and just forgotten? But I knew I hadn't. There was no way I'd forget something like that. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more it messed with my head. The strangest part was the way the chair seemed to be getting closer to my desk. It was subtle at first, just a few inches closer every day. But soon, it was undeniable. No matter where I placed it, by the next morning, it was always closer. It was as if the chair had a mind of its own, a purpose I couldn't begin to understand. And with each passing day, that purpose seemed more ominous. I started avoiding the study altogether, only going in when absolutely necessary. But even then, I felt the chair's presence, almost like it was waiting for me. I tried moving it to another room, thinking maybe it just needed a change of scenery. But the moment I did, things got worse. The creaking followed me throughout the house, like the chair was unhappy with its new location. I could feel its displeasure, almost like a child throwing a tantrum. And the shadow, there was always a shadow that seemed to linger just out of sight, darker and denser than any normal shadow should be. It clung to the corners, waiting for me to notice, daring me to confront it. Every time I walked past the study, I'd feel a pull, an urge to go in and sit in the chair. It was almost magnetic, drawing me in despite the growing dread in the pit of my stomach. But I resisted, knowing that something wasn't right. That chair wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore. It was something else, something that didn't belong in my home or in this world. And as the days went by, that something was growing stronger, feeding off the fear it was instilling in me. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The nights were the worst. During the day, I could almost convince myself that everything was normal, that maybe I was just overthinking things. But when the sun went down and the house fell silent, that's when the fear really set in. It started with small things, just a sense of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was in the house with me, something that didn't belong. I couldn't sleep, so I'd get up and wander through the house, trying to clear my head. But every time I passed the study, I felt drawn to it. The door would be ajar, and I'd see the faint outline of the rocking chair in the dim light. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I'd catch a glimpse of it, a shadow, darker than the rest, lingering near the chair. It was like it was waiting for me, daring me to come closer. But I couldn't. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. One night, I finally worked up the courage to step into the study. The chair was there as usual, facing the window, but the shadow. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had shape form, though it was still indistinct, like smoke that hadn't fully settled. It hovered near the chair, watching me, though it had no eyes. I could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, and I knew, deep down, that it was aware of me. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, before finally flipping on the light. The moment the light flooded the room, the shadow vanished. The chair was just a chair again, sitting innocently in its place. But I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't losing my mind. Something was there, something that wasn't part of this world. I turned off the light, expecting to see the shadow return, but the room remained still. I left the study, closing the door behind me, but the unease followed me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone in my bedroom. From that night on, the shadow appeared more frequently. It didn't seem to care whether the lights were on or off anymore. It would be there, hovering near the chair, always in the corner of my vision. And it wasn't just in the study now, it followed me, appearing in other parts of the house. I'd see it reflected in mirrors, just a dark blur that would vanish the moment I turned around. But the worst part was the sound. The soft, rhythmic creaking of the chair, even when I wasn't near it. It was like the chair was alive, and the shadow was its companion. Sleep became a distant memory. I was too afraid to close my eyes, knowing that the shadow would be there when I opened them. I started leaving all the lights on, thinking it might keep the darkness at bay, but it didn't help. The shadow was everywhere now, growing bolder with each passing night. I couldn't escape it, no matter where I went. It was as if the chair had brought something into my home, something that was slowly taking over my life. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to be done, but I didn't know what. I was too scared to confront it directly, but I couldn't just ignore it either. Every night, as I lay in bed, I'd hear the creaking of the chair, louder and more insistent, like it was calling out to me. And with it came the shadow, seeping into every corner of my house, of my mind. I was losing control, and I knew it. But the worst was yet to come. I couldn't go on living in fear, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. Something about that chair wasn't right, and I needed to know what. I started researching, digging through old records and talking to anyone who might have information about its origins. It wasn't easy. Most people looked at me like I was crazy when I mentioned a haunted chair. But eventually, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. The chair had a history, a dark one, tied to a name I'd only ever heard in hushed whispers: Jacob Thorne. Jacob Thorne was a notorious serial killer from the late 1800s, infamous for his brutal methods and the eerie calm with which he carried out his crimes. The more I read, the more I realized that the chair had been his. He would sit in it for hours, planning his next move, relishing in the twisted thoughts that consumed him. The chair wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was an extension of him, a tool he used to fuel his madness. And somehow, some part of him had stayed behind, embedded in the very wood of the chair. As I delved deeper into Thorn's life, I felt the chair's presence growing stronger, like it was feeding off the knowledge I was uncovering. I started seeing his face in my dreams, those cold, calculating eyes staring back at me, as if he was still watching, still plotting. I could almost feel his hands on the back of the chair, gripping it tightly as he thought about his next victim. And then there were the voices, whispers that seemed to come from the chair itself, urging me to do things I would never consider on my own. The more I learned, the more I felt the chair's influence creeping into my mind. It was like Thorn was trying to reach out from beyond the grave, using the chair as a conduit. I could feel his thoughts blending with mine, darkening every corner of my mind. It was terrifying, but at the same time, there was a strange allure to it, a pull that I couldn't quite resist. The chair was more than just haunted, it was cursed, and that curse was slowly wrapping itself around me, tightening its grip with every passing day. I tried to distance myself from the chair, spending as little time as possible in the study, but it was no use. The chair was always there, waiting, watching, its presence seeping into every part of my life. The more I tried to resist, the stronger it seemed to become. I could feel its power growing, feeding off my fear, my anger, my despair. It was like Thorn was still alive, still manipulating from beyond the grave, using the chair to carry out his twisted desires. The final straw came when I found myself sitting in the chair one night, without even realizing how I got there. It was as if the chair had called to me, pulling me in without my consent. And as I sat there, I could feel Thorn's thoughts merging with mine, his dark desires becoming my own. It was then that I knew I had to do something, before the chair consumed me completely. But what? How do you fight something that's already taken root in your soul? I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The chair wasn't just an object, it was a gateway to something far more sinister. And if I didn't find a way to break free, I would be lost, just like Thorn's victims. But how could I fight something I couldn't see, couldn't touch? The answer lay somewhere in Thorn's past, in the dark history that bound him to the chair. I just had to find it before it was too late. The moment I realized the chair was trying to possess me, everything changed. It wasn't just about the shadows or the creaking anymore, it was something far more insidious. I could feel it, like a dark cloud hovering over me, creeping into my thoughts, my dreams. Sleep became a battleground. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by the faces of Thorn's victims, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They were begging for help, but I was powerless, trapped in a nightmare that felt all too real. The chair's influence wasn't just confined to the study anymore, it had seeped into every corner of my life. I started losing track of time, forgetting things that had just happened, finding myself in places without any memory of how I got there. It was as if the chair was taking over, piece by piece, chipping away at my sanity. And the shadowy figure? It was everywhere now, following me like a dark echo, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. It wasn't just the nightmares, either. During the day, I'd catch myself thinking thoughts that weren't my own, dark, violent thoughts that made my skin crawl. I'd find myself standing over the chair, my hands clenched into fists, a rage bubbling up inside me that I couldn't explain. It was as if Thorn was still there, whispering in my ear, urging me to continue his work. I'd snap out of it, horrified, but the thoughts lingered, festering in the back of my mind like a disease. The more I tried to fight it, the stronger the chair's hold on me became. It was relentless, an invisible force that seemed to tighten its grip with every passing day. I started seeing Thorn everywhere in reflections in the corner of my eye, always just out of reach. But it wasn't just visions anymore. Sometimes I'd hear his voice, low and menacing, as if he were standing right behind me. He'd whisper my name, taunting me, telling me I was weak, that I'd never escape him. And part of me was starting to believe it. I became paranoid, jumping at every little noise, constantly looking over my shoulder. I stopped leaving the house, afraid of what might happen if I did. The outside world seemed distant, almost unreal, as if the chair had created a barrier between me and everything I once knew. My friends noticed the change, but I pushed them away, too afraid to let them get close. I couldn't risk the chair's influence spreading to them. I was in this alone, and the weight of that realization was crushing. The turning point came one night when I woke up to find myself sitting in the chair, a knife in my hand. I don't know how I got there, how long I'd been sitting like that. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was awake or still trapped in a nightmare. The knife felt heavy in my hand, the cold metal pressing against my skin. I dropped it, recoiling in horror, but the damage was done. The chair had crossed a line, and I knew I was running out of time. I couldn't keep living like this. The chair was winning, and if I didn't do something soon, I'd lose myself completely. But what could I do? Destroying the chair seemed impossible, and even if I could, would that be enough to break its hold on me? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing. I had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The chair's grip was tightening, and if I didn't act fast, it would drag me down with it into a darkness I might never escape. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The chair's influence was too strong, too dangerous. I had to get rid of it, but every time I thought about how, I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. Selling it was out of the question. Who would want a cursed chair? And even if I could find a buyer, could I really live with myself, knowing I'd pass this nightmare on to someone else? No, I had to find another way, something that would end this once and for all. I started by trying to destroy it. It seemed like the most logical solution. If the chair was gone, so would be its curse. But logic had no place in what I was dealing with. I took a hammer to it, but the wood wouldn't crack. I tried burning it, but the flames barely touched it, as if the chair was impervious to heat. Every method I tried failed miserably, and each failure only made the chair seem more invincible, more terrifying. It was like it was mocking me, laughing at my pathetic attempts to break free. With every failed attempt, the shadow grew stronger. It wasn't just a presence anymore, it was almost tangible, a dark figure that followed me wherever I went. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, hear its whispering in my ear, telling me to give up, to accept my fate. The more I fought, the more relentless it became, until it was all I could think about, all I could see. I knew I was running out of time. The chair was winning, and if I didn't find a way to stop it soon, it would consume me completely. In desperation, I tried to get as far away from the chair as possible. I packed a bag and left the house, driving aimlessly through the night, hoping distance would weaken its hold. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape it. The chair's presence was always with me, like a dark cloud hanging over my head, suffocating me with its weight. I couldn't outrun it, couldn't hide from it. It was a part of me now, and that realization filled me with a terror I'd never known before. Returning home defeated, I knew I had to confront the truth. The chair was indestructible. Whatever curse was attached to it, it was too powerful for me to break. But I couldn't just give up. There had to be a way out, some way to end this nightmare before it consumed me entirely. I started researching again, this time focusing on the occult, on ancient rituals and dark magic. I'd always dismissed that stuff as nonsense, but now I was willing to try anything, no matter how desperate or dangerous. The more I read, the more I realized I was in way over my head. The rituals were complicated, the dangers real. But what choice did I have? I was at the end of my rope, with nowhere else to turn. The chair's grip on me was tightening every day, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. I needed help, someone who understood this world better than I did. And there was only one person who might be able to provide that help, a local historian known for his expertise in the occult. If anyone could help me, it was him. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but I was willing to take the risk. The alternative was unthinkable. I couldn't live like this anymore, with the chair's shadow hanging over me, controlling my every thought, my every move. I needed to act, and fast, before it was too late. The historian was my last hope, my only chance to break free from the curse that had taken over my life. Little did I know, the journey I was about to embark on would be the most terrifying yet. Meeting the historian was like stepping into a different world. His house was filled with ancient books, strange artifacts, and a heavy air of mystery that made my skin crawl. He was an older man, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me, as if he knew everything I'd been through just by looking at me. I told him about the chair, about everything that had happened, and he listened without interrupting, nodding as if he'd heard it all before. When I finished, he didn't hesitate. He told me that the only way to break the curse was to return the chair to the site of its first crime and bury it there. I was skeptical, of course. The idea of taking the chair back to Willow Creek, to the very place where Jacob Thorne had committed his first murder, seemed insane. But what choice did I have? The historian explained that the chair was more than just an object, it was a vessel, a conduit for Thorne's spirit. As long as it remained intact, Thorne's influence would continue to grow, feeding off the fear and despair it created. The only way to stop it was to sever its connection to this world, to bury it where its dark history began. The journey to Willow Creek was one of the longest of my life. Every mile felt like an eternity, with the chair sitting in the back of my truck, looming over me like a dark specter. The closer I got, the stronger the shadow became, pressing down on me until it was hard to breathe. By the time I arrived at the old, abandoned site where Thorne's first victim had been found, I was barely holding it together. But I knew I had to see this through, no matter how terrifying it was. Digging the grave was harder than I'd imagined. The ground was rocky, the air thick with an unnatural chill that made my hands tremble. But I pushed through, driven by the need to be free of the chair's curse once and for all. As I dug, the shadow grew stronger, darker, until it seemed to envelop me completely. I could feel Thorne's presence, his rage, his desperation to hold on to the last vestiges of his power. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I was too close now. Finally, the grave was deep enough. I dragged the chair to the edge and tipped it in, watching as it tumbled into the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Then the ground seemed to shudder, as if the earth itself was rejecting the chair's presence. I quickly shoveled the dirt back in, covering the chair completely. The shadow twisted and writhed around me, its whispers growing louder, more frantic. But as the last bit of earth fell into place, the shadow let out a final, piercing wail before dissipating into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the freshly dug grave, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, no shadow, no creaking, no whispers. Just silence. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders for the first time in weeks. It was over. The chair was gone, buried with its dark history, and Thorn's spirit had finally been put to rest. But as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting. Driving back to Ravenswood, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd truly escaped. The chair was gone, but the memories remained etched into my mind like a scar. And there was something else, too, a nagging sense that the chair's curse wasn't completely broken. That maybe, just maybe, it was lying in wait, ready to resurface when the time was right. I tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind, refusing to let go. Even now, I can't be sure if the chair's curse is truly gone. I like to think that it's buried for good, that Thorn's dark influence has been severed once and for all. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that familiar creaking sound, faint but unmistakable, like the chair is rocking itself somewhere in the distance. And in those moments, I wonder if I'll ever really be free of it, or if the chair's shadow will always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for its next victim.